screen. And now let's start the discussion with the host of our book club, Diane Rehm.
Hi, everybody. It's so good to have you with us. And let me just tell you that this March meeting of the Diane Rehm Book Club is going to focus on the wonderful book, Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. It's an adaptation of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. The novel tells the story of growing up in Appalachia as the opioid epidemic began to take hold. But it's also a book filled with humor, insight, and even hope. Joining me today, Beth Macy. She's the author of Dopesick and Raising Lazarus. Mark Athitakis, a freelance writer who covers books for the Washington Post and the LA Times. He's the author of The New Midwest. And Amanda Claybaugh. She's professor of English and dean of undergraduate education at Harvard University. She's taking time out of her sabbatical in Munich to join us here today. And throughout the hour, we'll be taking your questions. You can type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as we can. Welcome to all of you, Beth, Mark, and Amanda. So good to have you with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Good. Mark, the epigraph from David Copperfield begins this novel. Quote, "It's in vain to recall the past unless it works some influence upon the present." Why do you think Barbara Kingsolver starts her novel this way? And how do all of you believe it's relevant to today's world?
Well, I think in some ways it's kind of a mission statement for Barbara Kingsolver's work in general. I mean, she's one of our working novelists who is perhaps more invested than many in the idea that fiction has a social justice purpose. In 2000, she launched something called the Bellwether Prize, which she helps select a manuscript that focuses on social justice goals. And if there's a critique of her work, sometimes it's that she can be a little bit didactic on this point. And Demon Copperhead kind of has there are scenes that are literally in a classroom, but she has it's one of those slap your head sort of things, because it's such a brilliant fit for her to kind of access what Charles Dickens was trying to do in the social novel, interest in social justice, and trying to tell a story that is focused on social issues that we're dealing with today.
Absolutely. Amanda, how do you see it?
It's interesting. When you read that quote, it reminded me of a passage that really stays with me from the novel, where toward the end of the novel, when Demon is asked by his therapist, she says, it would be therapeutic for you to recount the story of how you got here. And so he faces some real challenges doing that. And I think he personally faces challenges remembering his past in a way that is orderly, yes, and that will enable him to understand his life. And then I think Barbara Kingsolver is working very hard to think about, what does Demon's life tell us, and what does his retrospect about his life tell us about the social issues that Mark is talking about. So there's really a kind of a double question. There's an individual psychological question. How do you make sense of your life after you live through a lot of trauma? And I think the passage you've quoted says, you should only think about the trauma to the extent that it is helpful to you now. And then there's the question of how do we make sense of what's going on sociologically through the novel of social reform if we're looking at lives of great difficulty.
And Beth, Demon begins this book by talking about his birth, which he obviously has heard stories about from the caring next door neighbor. I mean, so he really starts right there. I was born in a bag. Talk about that.
Yeah, I think he says, first, I got myself born. Yeah. And what I love about that line is that he's still alive to tell the tale, right? Because right away, this is going to be a hard story. And you're like, how did this kid get so resilient? How has he managed to do that? And there are moments where I have to remind myself, oh, he's telling this story from today's point of view, right? And I think the genius of what Barbara did in this book is we are 2 decades into this crisis. There's a ton of opioid fatigue out there. And so I think what she did was she said, how can I write about this issue that I see in my community every day in such a way that people will want to bite it off? Because it's a hard thing. A lot of people, even people who have families and have struggled, even they have a hard time looking at it because it's so painful personally to them. And what she did, and I'm sure she'll tell this when she speaks in a bit, but she heard from Dickens to tell it through the kid, and that was just such a genius stroke, because a kid comes out, they're innocent, and what it makes us do through the course of the book, I think its power is that it makes us really have empathy for the now 7 million people in America who are addicted to opioids.
Beth, just to follow up on that, I mean, I think, this is a hard book to imagine in the third person, right? I mean, this book thrives on Demon's voice because it carries a kind of sarcastic humor that, doesn't necessarily lighten the story, but I mean, it wants to engage with this character. And I think also to the point of the opioid crisis, it doesn't quite enter the scene fully until more than halfway through the book. And I think one thing that Barbara Kingsolver does really well is show that this is sort of the culmination of generations of trauma in this community, where foster services are essentially feeding into child labor, where victims are not served by the justice system, where capitalism and mining companies have run rampant here. So it's, in talking about the opioid crisis, not as necessarily a subject specifically in itself, but as part of a larger set of dysfunctions that have been in Appalachia for generations.
And it's really so important to remember that Barbara herself lived in this area and has seen what has happened to generations of coal miners, generations of families who have literally been trapped and tramped by the capitalist system that came out of coal and coal mining. Amanda, for those who haven't read David Copperfield, as I did after reading Demon Copperhead, and we should say that Demon was actually given the name Damon at birth, but began to be called Demon. How closely does this book relate to Charles Dickens?
I mean, you can say it as well, having read them both, very close. I was surprised at how it's not just all the names, all the character names, but all the character temperaments, the plot events, large and small. I mean, it's a very, very tight correlation. And it's interesting because many authors return to the great works of the past. And I think when they do it, they tend to do it in one of two ways. Sometimes they go back in order to revise, right? And they're essentially saying, we now know something, or I now know something about human experience that was not available to that author, and I'm going to add, or I'm going to revise in some way. So therefore we get things like Dickens, Great Expectations from the perspective of the transported convict, or we get most recently an Iliad from the perspective of the slave women who are being fought over by Achilles and Agamemnon. That is not what Barbara Kingsolver is doing. She is returning to the past in order to repeat. She's one of those who basically imagines that, or takes this great work from the past to have really gotten it right in an important way, and to feel like this is a timeless story. It's a very it's a very time-bound story. Like all of the details of the opioid crisis and everything that happened in Appalachia over centuries are all there, but it's also a timeless story that can be retold and retold about children and ultimately adults being treated terribly because people are indifferent to their suffering. And I think Beth makes a really important point about the value of telling the story through a child. Because one thing that authors, socially conscious authors have to think about is how to get their readers to sympathize with the sufferers. And that can be hard to do when you're thinking of someone who has, is completely in some kind of, mental state from taking opioids. It seems very remote. But I think we can all identify with the child and how the child suffered. And that is the way in to then realize the adults are suffering just as much and are just as worthy of our concern.
I think we should point out, as David Copperfield does, that in this book, Demon's mother remarries because his father is gone. He's died before he's even born. And so Demon's mother remarries Beth and remarries a guy who sure ain't good to Demon. And then when his mother dies, oh my gosh, this poor kid is caught up in the worst that society can offer. And it's as though nothing has changed since David Copperfield.
Yes. I mean, I know she did a ton of research to do this book, and having researched this issue for almost a decade myself, I mean, the details she has in here are, I mean, it's as if it's been fact-checked by the fact-checkers at the New Yorker or something. It is so perfectly put. I mean, I'm not talking about the art of it, which is amazing. I'm talking about like the data she has in there. Like in those early years when OxyContin scourge first came upon this nation, we had foster care tripling within a first 3 or 4 or 5 years, tripling. And so her choice to show what happens to Demon, who gets, taken under these wing by these very poorly paid social service workers who work for privately held companies. It's just so accurate. And the way she even weaves in the history, like, I think you learn about the Whiskey Rebellion through Demon, he's true. So freaking funny, that kid. There's something, the thing that works about him is you 100% love this child. And you're going to follow him anywhere. And he gives you a little nugget on every single page that is both a like suck in the gut in a literally a laugh out loud. I just think it's brilliant.
Absolutely. Mark?
Well, I was just going to say, I think one other brilliant aspect of this is how this crisis sort of slowly insinuates itself into the narrative. He first hears about Oxy when his mother dies, but the Aunt June character, who is smart as a tack and on top of everything, she winds up dating a Purdue Pharma representative, and and winds up becoming absolutely infuriated because he is a death merchant. But it takes a while for everybody to kind of gain this awareness between, oh, this thing is on the scene, people are taking it recreationally, and then the rise of the pill mills and the fact that that community specifically was targeted because it is so impoverished and so in need. So I'm trying to think of how long of a period the novel mostly stretches, like maybe 5 or 6 years or so, but for the heart of it. But I mean, just in a few short years, you go from knowing nothing about what's going on to this just being absolutely overwhelming this community.
And almost everybody says that. They all have a memory in real life of the moment when everybody started locking their doors, because people who were jonesing for the drugs and were going to get dope sick if they didn't get it, started stealing rampantly, and crime of a level. And you really feel that through his story.
You were going to say something, Amanda.
Well, I was just going to ask Beth, because one thing that I wonder how accurate it is and whether this accords with your sense of the crisis. Because in the 19th century, there's a lot of concern about alcohol addiction, drug addiction, and those are described often as, states of delusion, of lassitude. So I expected a book where once everybody was on opioids, they would be lying on some couch, and the really astonishing and powerful part of that for me was when Demon says, you have to work so hard to be a junkie. You're constantly hustling. And that in a way, qualities that we tend to associate with sort of upright, law-abiding life of working really hard every day, he's demonstrating a huge amount of energy and a huge amount of concern. I mean, another thing that I thought was very moving was that it would be easy to make the Dory character this terrible, bad siren who led him into addiction. But actually, it is depicted, their relationship, as catastrophic to both of them, but also very loving. She gives him the drugs because she feels for his suffering. He hustles to get more drugs for her because he loves her so much. It's a parody of a terrible parody of a very loving relationship. So I wondered if that chimes with, your sense of how all of this plays out.
Absolutely. I mean, it's that the reason I called my first opiate book Dopesick was because I thought if that was the only thing I could explain, it would really go so far into showing that they're not doing it to get high. They're not dumb. They're not greedy. They're not all these things these companies have done to them are. In fact, they're people with a treatable medical condition who are self-treating their fear of withdrawal, which they all say is like the worst flu times 1,000. And I mean, she nails it all the way through. And they are wise, and they are scrappy, and they are hardworking. The first kid who ever told me about the word Dopesick, he came to the premiere of our show on Hulu, and he said, "Dude, I taught you that word." He said, "Look, if you knew your dope man wasn't coming till Thursday, and on Monday you had this amount of heroin, you would parse it out because you would do anything not to have a day without this medicine."
Let's talk about some of the other characters in the book who are so important. Let's talk about the Peggotts, Mark. The next door neighbors to Demon, and the important part of his life, saving his life, giving him life, that they play.
Well, through Demon's life that he doesn't have too many opportunities to rise above his station. What does he have in terms of agency? He has his art, which becomes more and more important to him personally and professionally as the story goes on. And he has the people who are there to support him, because he has a whole universe of people who are actively menacing him. But in the Peggotts, he finds a group of people not only that want to protect him, but also that taps his reserves of empathy, and he wants to protect them back. There's a bit early on when he's talking about his friend nicknamed Maggot, which is kind of obviously not a great nickname for somebody, but what he says is that he recognizes fairly early on that Maggot is queer, and so he gives him that name to protect him from worse ones that he might get as he gets older. So obviously, I mean, the extended sort of Peggott clan becomes really important for him because they are sort of his foothold into what human empathy might be like, and lacking a lot of good other options, that is going to be part of his escape hatch.
And it's extraordinary what a huge circle of young people surround the Peggotts, because they are so welcoming. They're so inviting. They feed kids. They help kids. They certainly help Demon, Amanda. So they come out as heroes in this book.
They do, although, I have to say, one thing that strikes me about Mrs. Peggott is that moment where she draws a boundary and she refuses to take him in as a foster child.
Yes.
And it's so striking to compare that to David Copperfield, where Peggotty is, the nurse, the sort of governess nurse who had taken care of his mother and then devotes her life to helping David whenever she can. And it's an example, one of the very few ways that I think Kingsolver does revise Dickens is to make the female characters something less than 100% self-sacrificial. They're like 90%. Because as you say, the Peggotts are taking in just scores of children, and it's completely understandable that they say to Damon, "We can't take you too." But she does have a kind of limit to what she's willing to do, and it's very wounding to him. And
here's a comment from one of our listeners who says, "I really love the characters of the married teachers and how they encouraged Demon and gave him a sense of the gifts he had within the community of people there, so many who took advantage of him. I was always so glad to see them pop up on the page." How did you feel about that, Beth?
I felt relief for Demon. I mean, we all have those key teachers in our life where things could have maybe gone wrong. For me, it was a band director. And for him, I mean, I think also what she's doing is she's showing that Appalachia is just like everywhere else. There's good people, there's bad people, and there's this sense of resourcefulness that we have here in the mountains that we can stretch a dime farther than anybody. We grow our own food, we grow our own whiskey until it gets taxed, or our own goods to make whiskey. And we've always been that way, and we've always looked out for each other. And so I think she's really celebrating the character of Appalachia, which has been so maligned for centuries.
Indeed. And those teachers there, Mark.
Well, I mean, I think the other thing that is important in terms of their role is that they are, key to teaching Demon that he's part of an exploited class. That they talk a little bit about the Melungeons, which I didn't know anything about until I read this,
and I had to look it up.
Right, but that is sort of again, he kind of treats it as like, okay, one more reason for people to denigrate us, or when he works on near a landfill at a shop run by a Mr. Ghali, who is an immigrant from India and who is an untouchable. He's starting to get this sort of glimpse of the world that he's not necessarily responsible for him being put in a position that he is in, that there are people who are making decisions about who counts and who doesn't, and he's aware that he's being treated as one of those people who doesn't. And he's also reading Dickens in class, where he discovers that I think he says something along the lines of, "You think he'd grown up around here," how well aware he was of how people are treated.
Explain who the Melungeons are, Mark.
They were Beth maybe might be able to answer more specifically, but I believe that they are a mixed race enclave that was living in Appalachia for many generations, correct?
Exactly.
Yes, and I think Native American in there too.
Indeed. And here's another audience a comment, really. She says, Lisa says, I was in awe from the first page. How does one brilliant writer capture a personality so distinct as Demon Copperhead's? More so, how does one writer capture a persona that is tender and hilarious in spite of hardship? If Barbara Kingsolver ever tires of writing novels, she's sure to have a success with comedic writing. In spite of tears, I found myself laughing out loud many times. And that's something I want to say here as we talk about the disparity and the poverty and the drug addiction. There is so much humor in this book, Amanda. It really got to me.
I couldn't agree more. And in fact, I know we're supposed to be thinking about David Copperfield as a pretext for this book, but for me, the really powerful model is Huckleberry Finn. This is the Huckleberry Finn voice. It's the voice of an outsider, rejected, non-educated child with, earthy humor, really powerful command of a demotic language, and having this kind of double perspective or affording us a double perspective, because Damon sees through the adult world through a child's eyes through much of the novel. And we see through his eyes the failure of the adult world it reminds me of that famous moment in Huckleberry Finn where he says, well, then I'll go to hell, because everyone has told him slavery is good. And he accepts that the adult value system must be correct. And so he blames himself for his own compassion for the enslaved. I think something similar happens in this book where Demon, who seems like a lovely person, keeps saying, I'm so bad. Everybody else is good and generous and nice to their friends, and I'm so bad. He's not bad. But he has internalized an adult point of view, and he is, as a child, really not just funny, but a moral touchstone in this world. So
indeed.
Very Huckleberry Finn.
Two more characters I really want to bring in, Ham and Emmy. I mean, I think they are both such important characters in this book, Mark.
Well, I think Emmy, especially to my mind, because I think Emmy is the example of Demon recognizing the influence that he wields in other people's lives, because he's the person who connects Emmy with Fast Forward, who he idolized for lack of anybody else to idolize when he was a young child, even though he is arrogant, narcissistic quarterback on the football team.
Exactly.
But he doesn't have anybody else to look up to, so he is the guy. It is his regret of connecting Fast Forward to Emmy that kind of leads to one of a kind of a series of moments of clarity for him. But it's his own awareness of, goodness, I have an influence on other people's lives just as, say, the Peggotts or those teachers in school have on me.
When we think about Emmy, she really becomes someone that we're pulling for, and yet we know she's going in the wrong direction. And it's almost as though you want to say, oh no, don't go there, don't do that. Beth, did you feel that way?
Yeah. I mean, the whole thing is just a thrilling ride, and it's scary just the way, a person, we've all read about the person who got their first OxyContin prescription, and when it's out, their doctor doesn't want to refill, and by that point they're getting dope sick, but they don't even know that word or know that concept. It's a really scary thing. And yet I think this being a portrait of someone in recovery, there is such value to that. I mean, Demon, spoiler alert, I think most of the folks have read the book by now, but he recovers. He's working on it. And that's a rare storyline that we actually see. Most people with opioid use disorder, there's a 40% according to SAMHSA, think they can't get better. And the country itself has written off this population. But until we, do the research and really understand that recovery is possible, a lot of our policies aren't going to directly help to close up that treatment gap, which is so important. And this character being in recovery is just a great statement for there is hope.
And right here is a question from a listener. Why do you think Demon survived when so many around him did not? Mark?
This kind of gets me thinking back to what Amanda was saying about that Huckleberry Finn voice. I mean, I think that is really, really true. And it literally, in this novel, it saves his life because he creates this superhero character called Redneck, it is upending all of these tropes about Appalachia, reclaiming them for himself, satirizing it. It is his ability to mock the way that people mock the residents of Appalachia.
You should say that it's published in the newspaper that his friend Tommy Waddles is working on.
Exactly. And then it winds up becoming kind of a sensation. People start, mimicking some of the things that he talks about in the comic strip. It becomes syndicated. I mean, it is, kind of a weird sort of meteoric rise to semi-fame, semi-fortune. But, I think, to Beth's point, it is a little bit of an outlier, but, it is so important in terms of for his recovery to be able to access his voice and point the finger at the people who are creating these tropes and these prejudices.
Indeed. There are so many wonderful characters in this book, but a listener reminds us, talk about Angus, Amanda.
Angus. Well, she's the other character who gets updated in terms of when I was saying that in Agnes in David Copperfield is one of these 100% self-sacrificial women. She's wise. She always directs David. She quietly sits on her love for 1,000,000 years without saying anything. Angus is not that. Angus has, she is a moral North Star for him, but she's strong. She's tough. She tells him when he's wrong, and she stands up for herself. So she's a remarkable character.
And her name, she changes herself to Angus instead of Agnes. She is just wonderful. You talked about Fast Forward, Mark, and he really is the demon in this book, if I may say that. And it is his athletic ability, but also his personality draws people in to want to follow him, to be like him, to mimic him, to live in his shadow. And he is one of the ones who is extraordinarily attached to the opioids, Beth.
Mm-hmm. So are you asking me to kind of talk
go
about
ahead. Sure.
Well, I think one thing that Fast Forward sort of exemplifies is sort of the limited array of options that Demon is growing up into, because in terms of work, I mean, what does he do? He works on a tobacco farm, which is toxic. He winds up working in a landfill, which is, basically to help support a meth lab. What are the ways out that are sort of acculturated there? One of them is football. And obviously this goes very poorly for Demon because he winds up getting a knee injury that everybody is sort of saying, well, the football is important out here, so you've got to kind of get back on the field, even though realistically he should just quit playing football for at least a year. And I think Fast Forward kind of exemplifies that sort of severe constriction that, like, if you're not a football hero, you don't really have a lot of standing here. And there's something really unfortunate about the idea that, it's sort of this sort of fake kingdom for lack of any other better options for escaping that community. Or improving it, rather.
There is such an abundance of glorious writing about nature in this book. And one of our listeners says, please talk about the plants, the trees, the bodies of water, the flowers, and lots of bird song. What does that signify, Amanda? And along with that comes another question. Do you see demons constantly frustrated attempts to see the ocean as associated with his being landlocked in trying and failing to escape his upbringing, culture, and social disadvantages? Both those really go together quite nicely, Amanda.
I'll take the ocean question because I feel like Beth may have more to say about the landscape. The one important way that this novel departs from David Copperfield is in its ending. David Copperfield is like a typical 19th century Bildungsroman, as we say, novel of education. And those novels show someone going from youth into adulthood, and it ends when they find their place in the world. And they find their place in the world by finding their spouse and finding their career. And once you know what those two things are, you know the whole rest of your life. So David Copperfield ends with him. He's an author, he's married to the right woman. And then 10 years later, we get a little retrospect and everything's still the same, but more so because once you figure out your wife and your career, everything else is set. That's not what we get here. What we get is finally he's going to reach the ocean. And I love that ending because we have a good feeling about it. We know he's on the right track. We know that he's going to become an author of graphic novels. We sense that Angus is going to have a big part in his life. But what shape all of that will take and what will happen next remains kind of mysterious. And its place is taken by our thought of what is it going to be like when he sees this, what will be for him the first time a completely sublime landscape. And so it ends in a kind of beautiful mystery and a lot of freedom. We don't know what will happen next.
But earlier in the novel, in Demon Copperhead, when he's stuck in the city, he sees nothing but cement. He sees no flowers. He sees no grass. He sees nothing that enriches his soul. And he's missing it. And here, Barbara Kingsolver brings in all of this glorious writing about nature, Beth.
Yeah, of course, she's done that in all of her books. And we know she's a scientist. Yes. And I love what she's doing. She's celebrating these natural traits that we have here in the mountains. I was interviewing her a few months back, and she made a comment, something like, my well-meaning urban friends say, how can you stand to live in the middle of nowhere? But I grow my own food. My water comes from a spring on my property. I love my neighbors. This is my everywhere. And I think using the landscape as her touchstone, as a power, as a healing presence, She is really saying, this is my everywhere.
Mark, do you want to add?
I can't think of a whole lot more to add beyond what Amanda or Beth would have to say, but I mean, I absolutely agree. I mean, I think the sense of disorientation that Demon describes when he goes into Knoxville and he sees a city for the first time, I mean, it really does. It kind of creates a sense of place in the inverse, because you realize that he has been so removed from that, the idea of paved streets and just entire blocks that are filled with just nothing but buildings. It really does help clarify his character, and it clarifies where he is living without overly romanticizing it or criticizing it as well.
Here's another question from a listener. Fast Forward is a football hero, but it doesn't save him or let him escape. Mm-hmm. Why should folks from Lee County have to escape? Amanda?
Well, that just reminds me of to me, the most powerful line, which comes almost at the very end when Damon goes back and sees the coach who inadvertently addicted him to opioids, or sort of watched as that happened. And the coach is now himself in recovery. And Demon thinks, he was just one of the many people who don't see the value in a boy like me. They think that we're valuable only for tobacco fields, football fields, battlefields. And it's, we are bodies to be used by other people toward their ends. And then he says, and I thought it's something I still think about what exactly it means. He said, he didn't know how to say that to the coach, but he had shown up, and they're both in recovery, and they know that showing up says something. So there's something about, language is failing, but the practice of, every day doing your recovery routines, making your amends by being in person together, even if you can't quite say the words yet, that all seems very powerful. And as I was reminded of that, Beth, when you were talking about how important it is to give a sense of the possibility of recovery.
Mm-hmm. Diane, I mean, I want to kind of riff maybe a little bit on that point of escape, because, it's not because it's necessarily there's something inherently bad about the place. It's just that it is a story of options foreclosed. I mean, one character that I think is really fascinating, even though she doesn't occupy much of the story, is one of Demon's classmates. Her name is Bettina. And so she is the kind of stereotypical rich girl. And I think what she is doing in this novel, sort of echoing the J.D. Vance hillbilly elegy line that says, well, there's just something fundamentally lazy about the people who live in this community, and that there is some lack of bootstrapping that is going on, and they're not creating their own fortunes. And this whole book is in service of the notion of any opportunities for fortune have been completely stripped away. So Demon doesn't resent Angus for leaving the community to go to college. It is just a recognition that Bettina has it exactly wrong, and lacking a large restructuring there, that getting out, going to college somewhere else just may be one of the better options.
Amanda?
No, I'm just agreeing.
You're just agreeing. Okay. Here's a comment. I found David Demon Copperhead to be exceptionally superb at leading the reader into identification with Demon. However, I have to think he was saved by his exceptional talent. What if Demon had just been a regular kid? No chance. The book would have had a very sad ending. And Beth, I'm sure you've seen many, many of those.
Yes, I have. And a lot of times it's just luck. It's just bad luck. Sometimes it's good luck. But I know we talked about the teachers before and the neighbors.
Yeah.
That is so important. And as Amanda was just talking about, the power of people being in community together in recovery. There's a great activist named Suella Kobach from Lee County who says the answer is always community. And I think she's so right about that. And so when I hear things like, well, why don't these people just leave? You know, there's nothing for them there. I think this is coming from somebody who's never had a problem and who also doesn't understand the richness of some of their lives. And people can't just leave when they have families and kids and no 529 to send their kids off to college. I just think what she's done here is a remarkable story of a very specifically resilient person who the reader, maybe someone that remarkable doesn't quite exist in the real world, but she's showing us that there is a way forward when we come together, as Suella said, in community.
And I think that part of that is love, Mark.
Mm-hmm.
And love plays a huge role in this novel.
Yeah, I mean, I think, without Demon's capacity for compassion, which I think that in itself is not unique. I mean, but I think it's compassion plus sort of dumb luck that, makes him who he is. I mean, I think one thing that Barbara Kingsolver makes clear in this novel is that, this is not a model for social change. This is a kid who was lucky and got out. Even he's doing the right things in terms of building that community and supporting that community. But this novel is littered with corpses. I think just one of the saddest parts of this book is when he goes to help recover Emmy and he steps into a room and he sees just 2 abandoned children, and we don't know what happens to them at all. And that just sort of like kind of sticks with you. So, I think he is constantly being, presented with evidence that, love, compassion, support are going to be crucial for him being able to recover, but it's not a guarantee of anything in, this environment, especially when it was just so overwhelmed with the opioid crisis.
And here's another question. Can you talk about Rose? Why does she lead Demon to the waterfall? Amanda?
I'm going to have an unsatisfying answer to that, which is that this is sort of in the original, that the fast forward character has a kind of ambivalent sidekick who hates him but loves him, and it leads to his death. I think a question would be that I would ask is, why do we need that kind of half loving, half hating sidekick character? Why do we have a Rose? And I feel like maybe she is acting out Demon's own ambivalence about Fast Forward, whom he loves and hates. Fast Forward is someone who brings forward both of those emotions.
Interesting. Any thoughts, Mark?
About the Rose character? Yeah. Frankly, I mean, not really.
I mean, she sort of comes out of nowhere and insists that Demon go to this place where disaster happens. And I think you make a good point, Amanda, about the ambivalence there. And maybe the ambivalence that's there through a lot of characters, except we can say Demon's caring relationship with Maggot. I think the two of them are so caring for each other, and they're always there for each other. And that is so important in terms of, you're talking about, Beth, some of the things that can save people, like luck and love, but certainly friendship has to play a great role.
Absolutely. You know, there's this thinking in a lot of what we hear about addiction and what we see in shows like Intervention, that you have to let the person hit rock bottom. You have to kind of let them hit rock bottom, and as if somehow they will have this flash and suddenly won't need to use opioids. And in rock bottom, in an era of fentanyl, is often death. And so to have that one person that you know you can always count on, sometimes it's a mother or a sister, or it's a friend like Maggot, that is just so key, that she's underscored that in this book.
Now, Beth, we have another question for you. The history of Appalachia is one of exploitation and oppression, from the coal companies to the makers of Mountain Dew, to the fracking companies, to the opioid drug manufacturers, to Donald Trump and the Republican Party. These people have been, frankly, abused. What can we do to help reverse this situation? And in what way are we complicit in this exploitation?
That's that's a whole nother session.
It's a big one.
But I so agree with it. And you know, Donald Trump came right in and you know, made this forgotten land feel like he cared about them, right? The jobs went away in globalization, NAFTA, China joining the WTO in 2001. And we did nothing for the people left behind. President Clinton said it'll be a win-win. It wasn't a win-win for those people. The people in Appalachia are going to be generations recovering from this, if they ever do. So I think it's really important that, you know, first of all, we understand that Purdue specifically, maker of OxyContin, specifically targeted areas where they were already prescribing competing opioids, bought off the FDA, and came in and said, look, the FDA allows us to say our drug is better, less prone to abuse and addiction. They targeted those areas that had already been screwed for centuries. I mean, it is just diabolical when we think about it. 7 million people addicted, and we have an 87% treatment gap. What we need to do is to put pressure on our elected leaders, first of all, to close that treatment gap, and second of all, to put some guardrails in there about the revolving door at the FDA, but also, is it really okay that a family of millionaires that wanted to be billionaires are going to get to do an end run around justice? The DOJ needs to do its job, and I think we can all call our legislators and say that until somebody goes to jail, white collar crime will continue.
Amanda, we have just a few moments left. Let's talk a little about Tommy.
Tommy is an interesting character because he's one of those who highlights the power of luck, the role of luck in all of these stories, because we have, you know, you can explain Demon becoming addicted because, you know, he was in foster care and all of this, but so too was Tommy, and Tommy didn't. And then on the other hand, you could say Bettina is coasting along doing fine, but actually Emily often is, you know, Emily's doing quite well, and then she becomes, so there's this sense of I think it's an attempt to dramatize what Beth was talking about, that it's very chancy who's going to fall and who won't. But Tommy, the other thing I would just say quickly about Tommy is that he's the Dickens character, because Dickens began as a writer, writing captions for an illustrator. So just as Demon is doing illustrations and then Tommy starts writing some text, that's how Dickens got started with his novel career.
And what about the macabre-like characters, Mark?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think they are an example of that, you know, to the point that Beth was making, that this is a community of people who try to work hard. But, in the case of the Macabres / the Macabre, they are kind of a series of, failed, misguided efforts from, selling Amway to trying to be dog breeders to that sort of thing. If you do not have anything, that is like a strong educational or workforce infrastructure in a place, you're going to be victimized and exploited in terms of making money. And I think, it turns out it becomes this sort of passive cruelty to Demon, because they forget to feed him, or just feel like they are so poor that they're not going to feed him. So, I mean, they really do sort of exemplify just, a serious problem in that community.
In the end, for all of you, we have just a couple of moments left. Is this a novel that gives you hope, Beth?
It does. I mean, I just love the characters so much. And I know there are people like him out there that are resilient and learn ways to be resilient and learn ways to heal through art. And just such a good example that there is a way out. So I mean, we have to have hope. This idea that we're just so hopeless and we're going to let 7 million people with this this medical condition go untreated. I mean, we have to have hope in order to battle the stigma that continues to create this crisis and make it work.
And I'm afraid that's all the time we have. I'm sorry. I want to thank the three of you so much for joining our discussion. Beth Macy, Mark Athitakis, and Amanda Claybaugh. You were just wonderful, and it was a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
And in about 15 minutes, I'll be interviewing Barbara Kingsolver about her inspiration for Demon Copperhead and what it means to be an Appalachian writer. You can still register for that link in the chat. And a quick note, our April book club meeting will be a little different since I'll be away. We've decided it might be fun to turn the tables on me with the producer of the book club, Allison Brody, asking questions that you might want me to answer. You can submit those via a form we'll send out. So just watch your inbox for more information. On the last Wednesday of April, you'll receive a link to that recorded interview. Finally, before you go, please take a moment to fill out a short survey about this event that's going to pop up on your screen. Our book club is produced monthly by Allison Brody. Adrian Danhauser is our engineer today. Allie Dickman is our events director. And of course, we couldn't do this event without the support of Michelle Keegan, Lauren Centrella, Berendra Silva, Jerry Washington, and Michelle Morgan. A very special thanks to all of those people, and most especially to you for attending today. I do hope we'll see you again next month. I'm Diane Rehm.
you.